Hello everybody, and welcome to day 18 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. Today we are on the final boss test, the third day of pinning and winning, and I'm going to give you two positions in this final test, and we're going to start with this position. It's white to move, and you can pause the video now. Alright, so in this position, it's rather a position that you would find in an opening or an early middle game, and you'll notice that everything's equal other than the fact that black is a little underdeveloped, and this is the kind of opportunity that you'll miss in a game if you're not quite sharp and always using a thought process to look at forcing moves. Now that's why I'm always talking about forcing moves and a thought process, because you'll notice that as much as this is actually a pinning combination, it also contains elements of the previous tactics like demolition of pawn structure and double attack. So let's just see what goes on here. All right, as white, you see that black has just played here, and now white could he has many developing moves, try to develop this bishop, get the rook into the game. I don't know, there's a lot of moves. But if you look at this advanced knight, you should always look at knight takes f7. I would say on every move, you should always look at forcing moves and see if they work. And actually in this position, knight takes f7, there's only two replies. There's rook takes, and there's king takes. Now, with knight takes f7, the king is actually forced to take, because if the rook takes, then the simple reply, queen to e6. And now this knight can't move anywhere, and he wins back a piece with some interest, namely a pawn. Alright, so if this knight moves anywhere, then he'll just take the rook, and he's threatening to take it, and there's no way to defend it. The rook can't come in because it's pinned, and the knight and the rook are relatively inactive, so they don't come to the aid. For example, if the knight was here, this combination wouldn't work, because now he could play knight to b6, and he has some problems. Alright, so the king takes, that's basically all you have to look at in this position. And then the check. Now, obviously, the king doesn't want to come in here because the rook would check, and that would be over even quicker. But actually, in this position, it basically just leads to an advantageous position for white. So let's just go further. So he wins his piece back, and now he's hitting the rook. White protects the pawn, and now he does have the bishop pair, and he's up a pawn. And black has some problems with his uncoordinated pieces. Now, white is threatening basically to play bishop to e6, d5, and then he'd just have complete control of the light squares. He'd bring his rook to the d and the c file, and black would have so many problems preventing white from getting into the 7th rank. So he tries to stop that with rook to f6. And now this is just the rest of the game. Bishop 2. You can see that the bishops just own the whole board. So essentially from the early position, I just wanted you to get right into this position, essentially, with being up a pawn. You'd have to see and especially calculate queen to e6, and then queen to f3, winning this knight back with a pawn. Alright, so let's just see. So basically white won this game by using his light square bishop to attack, and he played there, and then essentially, actually his opponent resigned in this position, which I thought was a little early, but it's very hard for black to play in this position. He's completely tied up, and there's really nothing he can do to stop white's plans of using, especially the light square bishop, to just win all of black's pawns and cause the king a lot of problems as well. Alright, so this was a warm-up. Now we're going to get into part 2, or position 2 of this video. Alright, in position 2, it's black to move, and you can pause the video now. When I talk from general to specific, those are kind of things that should pop out to you, and I would say, actually, if you're on your opponent's move, you can actually look for general considerations, and then after your opponent's made a move, you start calculating lines. That's a useful tip for a thought process as well. And in black's position, you notice that he has an open F file and an open B file that he basically owns. Now, the bishops are in contact, and you also notice that black has the two bishops. Now, the two bishop advantage is an advantage because the bishop that your opponent doesn't have is his main weakness, namely the squares that you occupy with that bishop. Now, black actually has an exchange sacrifice in this position, and he starts with rook takes b2. Now, in these kinds of positions where they are rather open and he takes the bishop, you see the power of the bishop pair here because they're completely centralized and there's so many threats. So black has a double attack threatening this f2 pawn as well as this knight. And now white has to make a choice on the poison that he wants to accept. If he goes, for example, rook here to protect the f2 pawn, then black will just win the knight. And if he goes here, then black gets in on the f-file. So these kind of things actually should pop out at you, and then the concrete lines is rather just to see how you can force your ideas on your opponent. All right, so let's go through the line. So white in this position chose to protect the knight, which is pretty much the only option. The rook takes, and now the queen is basically forced to takes there. Now in this position, it's actually a minus 3 or 4, depending on the line you pick, advantage for black. But I would say it's not so simple to play because white still has 2 rooks and for the queen, essentially. And black does have some pawns, but you have to be careful when fighting against 2 rooks to not let them get active. So let's see how black does that. So he starts checking the king to drive it further in to g3. He checks it again, goes back. Now, something that I calculated that was actually a mistake that I think is pretty educational is to go queen to f4, which is very logical just to try to continue attacking the king, but it's actually a mistake. And the reason for that is because this is a very educational moment, and I'd like you to pause the video again if you want to think about what the proper plan for black should be. It's not so simple. Okay. Now, actually, it is quite simple when you know it, but when you're in the thicket of variations trying to, especially when you're attacking the king, you can kind of get stuck on that. Now, black has 1 material, and he has these extra pawns. So his main plan should be to keep the light square bishop, which is a little bit stronger than the knight, and then try to create, or at least push forward a passed pawn. So that's why queen to f4, if you just look at the line, for example, queen to f4, the king on g1 is actually a lot safer, and there's really no way that white can attack, for example, queen to g3. Then the knight would just take your bishop, and there's always options to just play rook here or here eventually to protect the pawn, and there's nothing that black can do about that. All right, so the correct plan in this position is bishop to f5, keeping your bishop. And the reason that queen to f4 doesn't work is because if you move the bishop then, there's nothing to protect this pawn. So now he tries to stop this pawn, but it just causes too many problems. All right, rook to c4 is what was played in the game. And now actually after queen to e6, white resigned because of the double attack coming in here and also hitting this rook. And now if he goes, for example, like rook here, he'll check and then just play d2. And he's going to pick up an extra rook. So that's why white resigned. All right, so you can see from the beginning of this position that, let's go all the way to the beginning, that black basically used the idea of a pin, I would say a pin on the knight as well as on the f2 pawn to essentially use the power of the bishop pair. Now this is where strategy and tactics kind of combine in that you take these general considerations, namely an open file, the bishop pair, and you use it to calculate concrete lines that can lead to a forced win. All right, so I tried to choose rather concrete positions for the last 2 here, and I feel that these were pretty complicated examples of pins, and I hope you enjoyed the last 3 days. Tomorrow on day 19, we have about 10 days left for 28 days to master level chess tactics, and I'm going to give, I think, 2 days to interference next. All right, so I'll see you in day 19 tomorrow. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.